Ever wondered where the name Australia comes from? Well, you're in for a treat, because the story behind it is way cooler than you might think. Picture this. Almost 2,000 years ago, when maps were basically just wild guesses, nobody had any idea there was this massive, untamed land down south. Australia wasn't even a real place in their minds, just an idea, a theory that some bold thinkers tossed around. But here's the kicker. Before it was called Australia, it went by some other names. And the story of how the capital city was chosen? Let's just say it wasn't a simple decision. In fact, it became one of the biggest debates in Australian history. And you'll also discover a surprising truth behind the meaning of the Australian flag, what those stars really represent, and why they're so important to the country's identity. It's more than just a flag, it's a symbol of Australia's story. Stick with me as we uncover 4 mind-blowing facts about Australia that you've probably never heard of. Trust me, this is one journey you'll want to take. Ever wondered where the name Australia comes from? It's actually got a pretty cool story, just like the land itself. Picture this, nearly 2,000 years ago, when maps weren't much more than guesses and imagination. Back then, the idea of a giant, wild land like Australia was more of a fantasy, just a thought in the heads of a few brave thinkers. So Australia actually comes from the Latin terra australis, which means southern land. But here's the thing. It wasn't really a discovery, just a theory. The Greek scholar Claudius Ptolemy, who was ahead of his time, is often credited with first suggesting the idea of a massive landmass in the southern hemisphere. All right, picture this. Back in 150 AD, Ptolemy was making maps in his famous book, Geographia. At the southern edge, he placed an enormous, unexplored region. He called it Terra Australis Incognita, which translates to unknown southern land. Why? Because he believed that, to balance out the known lands in the northern half of the world, there had to be an equally massive landmass down south. Here's the wild part. Even though this southern land existed only in Ptolemy's mind, the name Terra Australis appeared on maps for centuries. Jump ahead to the 17th century, and that's when explorers like the Dutch and the British finally landed in what we now call Australia. And guess what? They found it. They discovered the very land Ptolemy had imagined. So, what was just a guess in 150 AD ended up being the Australia we know today. Pretty crazy, right? An idea that stuck around for over 1,500 years, until explorers finally proved it in the 17th century. Before Australia got its modern name, a lot of it was actually called New Holland. This name was used by the Dutch in the 17th century when they began mapping the Australian coastline, particularly along the northwest and west. Back in 1606, a guy named Willem Janszoon was the first European to set foot in Australia. He called the area New Holland. But here's the thing. Despite all their exploration and mapping, the Dutch were never entirely sure if they had actually discovered the Terra Australis that Ptolemy had theorized about centuries earlier. So, while the name New Holland stuck around in Dutch territories for a while, it never became the name that the whole world agreed on for the entire continent. Before Australia became the official name, there was another term used, Australasia. This term didn't just refer to Australia, but also included New Zealand and the islands in the South Pacific. It was coined in 1756 by the French scholar Charles de Brosses in his book. Now here's where it gets interesting. The word Australasia is actually a combination of Australis, meaning southern, and Asia. So Australasia essentially means the southern part of Asia. Even though Australasia was a broader term, it never quite gained the same popularity or recognition as Australia, and never replaced it as the go-to name for the continent. So, how did Australia get its name? Well, the story begins in the early 19th century with British explorer Matthew Flinders. He's credited with suggesting the name Australia in 1804. Flinders became the first person to circumnavigate the entire Australian continent, and in his maps and writings, he started using the name Australia to describe the land. His big moment came in 1814 when he published his book, A Voyage to Terra Australis. This was where he officially introduced the name Australia to the world. Fast forward to 1824, and the British government officially adopted the name Australia, replacing the earlier term New Holland. And just like that, the name Australia was sealed as the one we all know and love today. When you think of Australia's most famous cities, what pops into your head? Sydney, with the Opera House and the Harbour Bridge? Or maybe Melbourne, with its cool artsy vibe and amazing food? But here's the kicker. Neither of these cities is actually the capital of Australia. Surprise! The title of capital actually went to a lesser-known city, Canberra. Let me take you back to 1901, when Britain created the Commonwealth of Australia. One of the biggest decisions they had to make was where the capital should be. Back then, Sydney and Melbourne were the two big dogs, and both wanted the honor of being the heart of the nation. But here's where things get interesting. The rivalry between these two cities got so intense that they just couldn't decide on a winner. Sydney seemed like the obvious choice. It was the largest city, an economic powerhouse with major trade routes and a busy port. It was buzzing with activity and had it all, except for one thing. The fear was that if Sydney became the capital, it would dominate everything. The federal government might have been overshadowed, and New South Wales could have ended up with too much power, leaving the other states at a disadvantage. So Sydney was out of the running. Now, Melbourne, the second largest city, had its own issues. While it was a cultural gem with a growing economy and vibrant art scene, Sydney wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea of Melbourne taking the capital title either. The rivalry was real. New South Wales, especially Sydney, didn't want Melbourne to become the capital because they feared it would shift too much power to Victoria. So what did this create? A deadlock. Both cities wanted it, but neither would back down. So how did the politicians break the deadlock? They picked a compromise, Canberra, a brand new city planned and built in a neutral location to ensure fairness. Canberra wasn't just established anywhere, though. It was carefully positioned on land originally part of New South Wales, but carved out to form a new territory, the Australian Capital Territory, ACT. Although Canberra is closer to Sydney, the location was strategically chosen to ensure neither Sydney nor Melbourne would dominate. A balanced solution for all. But before the permanent capital could be decided, there was a temporary solution. Between 1901 and 1927, Melbourne served as the de facto capital. Why Melbourne? Well, as the second largest city at the time, it was a major political and cultural hub, but it didn't have the same overwhelming influence as Sydney. It was far enough away to avoid too much power struggle, yet close enough for the government to operate smoothly. Melbourne was seen as the balanced option, which is why it temporarily held the title, even as the debate raged on. By 1908, the decision was made. Canberra would be the official capital. Construction started, and the vision was clear, not just to end the rivalry, but to create a city that represented all of Australia. A neutral space, free from the influence of Sydney or Melbourne. Building Canberra wasn't easy, though. The city had to be constructed from scratch, in a place that was as remote as it gets. They had to carve out roads, build infrastructure, water, electricity, public transport, basically create everything from the ground up. It wasn't a walk in the park. But by 1927, after a lot of hard work, Canberra was finally ready, and the capital moved there for good. You've probably seen the Australian flag, a lot of blue, white, and red. But did you know that even Australians don't always know the full story behind it? It was first created in 1901, when the Commonwealth of Australia was officially established. But here's the thing. Take a closer look and you'll notice that the flag has evolved just a little bit since its original design. Can you spot the differences? Let's start with the upper left corner. What do you see there? Yep, that's the Union Jack, the flag of the United Kingdom. And no, It's not just a decoration. Its presence on the Australian flag actually reflects Australia's colonial past and its status as part of the British Empire when the flag was designed. Even though Australia became a federation in 1901, it was still under British rule at the time, which is why the Union Jack stayed at the top left corner. Now, let's shift our focus to the stars. Yep, there are 6 stars on the flag, and each one has a special meaning. The largest star, the 6-pointed one, is right under the Union Jack. This is what we call the Commonwealth Star, and it represents the 6 original states of Australia: New South Wales, Queensland, Tasmania, Victoria, South Australia, and Western Australia. These were the first regions of Australia to come together as a federation, united under the British Crown. But here's the next part of the story. What happened when Australia expanded? Well, in 1908, the Australian government took control of the Northern Territory from South Australia, which meant Australia was now a nation with 7 regions: the 6 original states and the newly acquired Northern Territory. To reflect this change, the Commonwealth Star was updated by adding 1 more point, turning it into a 7-pointed star to symbolize the inclusion of the Northern Territory. And that's how the flag has looked ever since. Now let's talk about those 5 stars on the right side of the flag. Don't worry, they're not just randomly placed there. These 5 stars are actually part of the Southern Cross constellation, which holds a deep, almost sacred significance in Australian culture and history. The Southern Cross is one of the most iconic constellations visible in the Southern Hemisphere, and for early explorers, it was one of the first things they noticed when they arrived in Australia. It became a kind of symbol of Australia's connection to the southern skies. These stars, placed on the flag, represent Australia's unique position in the Southern Hemisphere. Here's something not many people know. When the flag was first created in 1901, those stars actually had different numbers of points, anywhere from 5 to 9 points, depending on their actual brightness in the sky. It wasn't until 1903 that the stars were adjusted to better reflect the actual structure of the Southern Cross constellation. All of the stars were given 7 points, just like they appear on star charts. So, why 7 points? Because when you look at the constellation itself in the actual sky, all of the stars are depicted with 7 points. But there's one little exception. The smallest star, Epsilon Crucis, kept its 5 points. Why? Well, that's because this star is much fainter than the others, and keeping its 5 points on the flag was a way to reflect its actual weaker brightness. Here's an interesting story about how Australia's flag came to be. So, back in 1901, when Australia officially became a federation, the country needed a flag to represent its new identity. To make this happen, Australia's first Prime Minister, Sir Edmund Barton, decided to hold an international competition to design the flag for the Commonwealth. And get this, 32,823 entries. Can you even imagine how many designs that is? After all the entries were reviewed, 5 designs that were nearly identical were selected as joint winners. It's kind of funny when you think about it. 5 designs that were almost the same ended up winning. But here's the interesting part. The prize money was a generous £200, and it was divided among the winners. Among them was a 14-year-old schoolboy from Melbourne. Yes, a teenager who became part of flag design history. His design, along with those of 4 other winners, formed the foundation of the flag we see today. Now, on the 3rd of September 1901, the Australian flag was flown for the very first time. It was a huge moment in the country's history. The ceremony took place in Melbourne, and that same day, the 5 winners were announced. Their designs were proudly displayed at the exhibition building, which, by the way, was the seat of the federal government at the time. It was a big day for Australia, as the flag was officially born and would go on to represent the nation for generations to come. Australia's history is filled with fascinating twists and turns, and it all began long before it became the nation we know today. The story starts with Captain James Cook's famous voyage in 1770. As Captain Cook's ship, the Endeavour, anchored in Botany Bay near present-day Sydney, he made a striking observation. Cook described the land as barren, unfertile, and unfavorable to happiness, contrasting the simplicity of the indigenous way of life with the European ideals of prosperity and civilization. But what Cook didn't realize was that this so-called barren land was actually bursting with life in ways that Europe never even dreamed of. The indigenous people had lived on this land for thousands of years, expertly adapting to its unique environment and resources. Cook and his crew, however, saw only the rugged coast and harsh terrain, and their views on Australia were colored by their expectations of fertile lands. While Cook focused on mapping and describing the land's apparent barrenness, he also brought along botanist Joseph Banks, who had a much more optimistic perspective. Banks marveled at the strange and unfamiliar flora and fauna of the land, discovering species that were unlike anything in Europe. He saw potential in these differences. Whereas Cook saw nothing of value in the land, Banks saw opportunity, a rich and untapped ecosystem with the potential to be a valuable British colony. This marked the beginning of an ideological split. Cook's pessimism contrasted with Banks' enthusiasm for the land's potential. Despite the harsh environment described by Cook, Banks believed Australia could be transformed into a thriving colony with the right intervention. His detailed reports on the land's resources, including its vast botanical wealth, helped convince the British government that Australia had great value, and it wasn't just in its strange plants. With Banks' support, the British government set its sights on establishing a presence in Australia. But what many people don't know is that the first settlers of Australia weren't wealthy adventurers or free men seeking a new life. No, they were convicts. In fact, the decision to send convicts to Australia came about largely due to overcrowding in England's prisons. By the late 1700s, the English prison system was under immense pressure, with jails full to bursting. The British were in a tough spot, and sending convicts to faraway lands started to look like a smart move. After much debate, the British government decided to send convicts to Australia, seeing it as a way to relieve their overcrowded prison system and establish a new outpost in the Pacific. On January 13, 1787, a fleet of 11 ships carrying over 1,500 people, including 730 convicts, set sail for the distant shores of Australia. But here's the twist. When the fleet arrived in Botany Bay, it wasn't the utopian paradise they had hoped for. Governor Arthur Phillip, tasked with establishing the new colony, quickly realized that Botany Bay wasn't the ideal location. The bay was shallow, and it lacked sufficient access to fresh water. With no time to waste, Phillip and his crew moved further north, eventually settling in Port Jackson, what is now known as Sydney Harbor, where they found a much more suitable location. The British settlers, including convicts, began to build their new lives in this harsh, unfamiliar land. What they didn't know was that the very land they saw as barren was already home to thriving indigenous cultures that had lived there for tens of thousands of years. The arrival of the British in 1788 marked the beginning of a long and difficult chapter for the indigenous people of Australia, whose way of life was forever changed. Despite the early hardships, the convicts, and later free settlers, eventually helped shape the modern nation of Australia. What began as a penal colony grew into a thriving nation, with a rich and diverse culture influenced by its indigenous people, British settlers, and waves of immigrants from around the world. To wrap things up, Australia's history, from its name to its flag and capital, is a fascinating journey of discovery, debates, and evolution. There's always more to learn, and these stories remind us of the layers that make up the unique identity of this incredible land. If you found these facts interesting, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below. Let me know what surprised you the most about Australia's history. Stay tuned for more fun and mind-blowing stories.